go from here? Just thinking about some of those key points that were pulled out in webinar one. If we can move on a slide or two, that would be great. And just one more. Perfect. So in terms of webinar one, some of the key things I said that are going to filter into the specifics of today. Employees actually, they want more flexibility on how and where they work and when they work. And part of that is that cross-border piece, that international piece. There's an element of wanting more control over their lives, over our lives, including that work aspect. There's a few things driving that. There's some cost savings around reduced commuting costs. And also, we shouldn't ever forget the fact that there are a lot of carer commitments around childcare or maybe looking after elderly relatives as well. We're already in the position where we believe we're seeing around half of roles that can be remote are now considered hybrid. And actually, there was also some talk about employers of record. I mentioned Deval and globalization partners, and we'll come on to this in more detail. How do they function, and when are they a good answer or a good fit for businesses moving into maybe new locations? The employer piece around this as well, I think, is one of the key considerations. And a lot of that is around flexibility is great, but there's always that balance with the risk legal requirements. What should we do to make sure we are compliant? So if we could just move on again, please. We've got a couple of poll questions today. Nice and easy one to start with. So if you could just spend some time just providing a response on this, that would be great. And it's based on just your current position and experiences. How comfortable are you that your companies have got a good handle on your remote working approach and the one that you've got in place? Very simply, we don't have this covered at all. Wouldn't be unusual. Partly comfortable, but we have a way to go. Mostly there, but there are some additional areas we need to work on, or we know exactly what we're doing. Just be useful if this, this result that comes through, thanks to the poll, ties in with what we think we're going to see or what we're actually seeing in practice. So do just spend some time just dropping a response on that. That would really help us understand where you are. We'll just give a little bit of time for that to come through, just to see what the outcome of that is. It'd be really interesting for us. So when we're ready and we've got enough responses, we'll just get that up in real time, just to see where we are. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. Really appreciate it. That is probably mostly what we expected to see. I would say the vast majority, which is what we're seeing in this poll result here, is we're somewhere between. We know we're on a journey with this, but we've got a way to go. We've got some areas we're not comfortable with. So thank you for that. If we then just move into the main body of the discussion, I'll start bringing the panel in here. It'd be great to have that discussion. So if we move on one more. Perfect. And I'm going to bring Laura in on this. Laura, let's just have a think about, before we get into some of the market research we're seeing and some of the current trends, give us a very brief recap here and the history around how have we got to this current way of working and what is the pace we've seen that it's being implemented at?
Yeah, thanks, Lee, and good afternoon, everybody. So in terms of where we are today and how we got here, it's, of course, no surprise to anyone that COVID was really the key turning point in how we now work. Pre-COVID, we spoke a lot as a profession about the future of work and the role technology would play in flexibility in the workplace. And we'd always predicted that there would be a change in working habits, but fair to say, COVID accelerated the change by a substantial number of years and paved the way for mass acceptance of remote working. Pre-COVID, technology had already got us to a place where people were benefiting from flexible or hybrid working arrangements. But in the main, this tended to be those with caring responsibilities, with the vast majority of people working in an office 5 days a week. Fast forward to 2024, and we now find ourselves in an interesting period where remote working is now fully accepted. However, hybrid working is very much considered the norm. And I think fair to say that the conversation is now becoming around what is the appropriate amount of time in an office that we should be together, and the growing theme that to be successful teams, we need to be together in person. From a cultural perspective, if we look at the Corn Ferry survey from a couple of years ago, 2/3 of global execs at that time agreed that corporate culture represents 30% of a company's market value, and that culture can only be established and maintained if everyone is at some point in the day occupying the same workplace. Given this statistic is of no surprise, 90% of companies plan to implement return to work policies as a result of this. And some CEOs actually suggesting that we should return to the office 5 days a week. On the flip side of this, our own economic engine survey from this year indicated that organisations are seeing an increasing demand from current or potential employees for even greater flexibility, with over a quarter stating that they would actually like to be able to work remotely from outside the UK. I think from my perspective, when considering trends in flexibility and remote working, I think it's really important to categorise the different types of remote workers that we see. So firstly, we have individuals who are hired from anywhere in the world on a fully remote basis, and that's due to a specific set of skills that the individual may have, and dependent on which country that they're based will often dictate whether the person is required to have any in-person contact by the employer. Secondly, and the more common remote working that we see is that's offered to employees as part of a benefits and reward package. And as our very own David Ellis has spoken about before, this can often be an attractive and relatively low cost benefit to offer if it's implemented well. In the main, what we see is typically it's people who are potentially foreign nationals working in the UK who use the remote working period to extend the period of time that they're spending in their home countries with their families, or individuals who have holiday homes abroad and wish to extend the amount of time that they can spend in their property. And then I think the third type of remote worker that we see are individuals who are displaced for political reasons and required to work remotely from another country, with Ukrainians being an example of this. Regardless of the type of remote worker under consideration, the challenges for the employer are often similar. So does the individual trigger a permanent establishment for corporate tax reasons? Is there an employer payroll obligation, social security liability to settle, etc.? And what we're seeing as a current trend in the market from our perspective is employers being very aware of the requirement to offer flexible international remote working for their employees. But asking us, well, how do I track this and make sure I'm on top of any of the risks? And from our perspective, the answer to this is typically around data. So how much data do you have and how much volume is there? So for organisations, only a handful of individuals who are remote workers, a case-by-case approach is probably appropriate. Whereas if there's a client with no data or vast volumes of data, you might want to start thinking about a technology solution to support. So just to sum up in terms of what I think we're seeing in the market at the moment, it's organisations being very aware about culture and the impact on individuals and their development within the organisation, and spending time together as a team, but at the same time, flexing the needs of employees from a talent attraction and retention point of view.
Okay, thanks, Laura. I'm just going to pick up, just thinking about the overarching theme of this webinar series. It's around workplace evolution. But do you think it'd be fair to say, or at least think about this, actually, have things moved on so quickly, it's almost a workplace revolution in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. And I think, like I say, when we were speaking to our clients about this pre-COVID, it was very much, you need to start anticipating the fact that the way we work today is going to change. And we knew that technology was developing at a really fast speed. And thank goodness that it was where it was when COVID did hit, so that, we could all continue to work in a similar way to how we were pre-COVID. And it's a really interesting point, isn't it? Is where would we be today if COVID hadn't happened, and what would have been that trigger that had that global acceptance around remote working? And I know as someone who benefited from flexible working pre-COVID, it certainly it didn't feel the same as it does now when everybody is participating.
Yeah, we're almost too successful at it, weren't we? We almost proved the concept too quickly. It was leave on a Friday, come back on a Monday, but you're not actually coming back, you're working at home, and it largely worked too well, I suppose. Now we're finding ourselves, as you say, in this position. It has absolutely accelerated where we were probably going to end up yesterday. Do you think it might be fair to say that some of this push and pull we think we're seeing, or we're seeing, is as a result of that, is that things have moved on so quickly, we're trying to find an answer to a question almost too quickly. We need more time to work through this, which is what we're trying to do, but there is a demand to get to an answer today and not in 5 or 10 years' time, perhaps.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think it's a real balancing act, isn't it? Because I think we now are all starting to see that there are absolutely benefits of people being in an office together. And I think vast majority of people do enjoy that being in an office together piece. But then I think as well, the people who've had the benefit or taken up their employers on the prospect of international remote working, that's been a specific category of individual at the moment. So it's going to be interesting to see whether people who don't have, property to go and work at in another location, how they may use the option to go and work internationally.
Yeah. And from what you're seeing as well, and I'll move on to get Di and Deval's thoughts on some of these areas in just a sec. But how many companies, how many of your clients have currently got some sort of formal framework, or at least informal framework in place, or a policy around managing remote working? Where have your contacts got to on that one, Laura?
Yeah, so I think the vast majority now have at least started the conversation if they haven't actually formalised the policy. But I think what has been really interesting is some of the stakeholders who've been involved in remote working policy. So I think traditionally, when it's come to cross-border work, the primary focus, at least for us, has been around tax and social security implications. But we're actually seeing a lot more about cyber risk. And so I have actually seen some clients where it's been the IT department that have actually developed the remote working policy rather than it sitting with HR or tax. So that's been quite an interesting one.
And I think that's one of the key points, isn't it? That we know there are multiple stakeholders, and it will depend on the business as to who those stakeholders are. But some of them you wouldn't even expect to be part of the conversation. Actually, they can be key, or like you say, almost driving overall the policy, because that is the key risk and the key determining factor rather for that company.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you, Laura. Really, really useful. And one of the things I think I'm taking away from this at the moment is there is still a disconnect. On the one hand, some people are saying they want to be in office more. I think most of us agree we want to be back physically in an office if we're office based a little more, but there's still the demand for flexibility. But there's more and more a push, I think, from companies around a return to office, and that may not be 5 days a week, but a more formal return to office where probably more of the time is being spent in office or in a work location rather than remotely. I think is one of the things I'm probably seeing as well on this. So if we could move on one more slide, and I'm going to bring Di in on this one. Di, just some things, thinking about you and your global immigration expertise and role. What are some of the current trends you're seeing in terms of where employees, I suppose, are choosing to remote work? And is there a disconnect there, or is there mostly an alignment around where employers are wanting remote workers to be? What's driving some of that, Di? What are you seeing?
Well, as you mentioned earlier on, thank you, Lee, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As you mentioned, Lee, in the start of this presentation, a lot of the driving sort of factors are based around costs, childcare, cost of living, and when I say costs, I mean like transportation cost, sort of like getting to work, buying lunches at work and stuff like that. So it's the cost per person, and also the lifestyle. You'll find that a lot of remote workers are looking for places with good weather, low cost of living, and where taxes are minimal, if not none at all. for instance, Dubai, that doesn't have any tax implications. The Caribbean, there's some islands over there that doesn't give tax, that gives tax breaks. And then again, conversely, you'll get to other countries such as now, for instance, South Africa. They've just opened up their remote working policy visa route, but they're taxing their individuals as well. The EU Commission is saying, look, where should the individual pay their taxes? So that's a huge, that has a huge impact on the decision. And I'm sure that, Laura and you actually will be able to give more insight to that. But those are the driving factors, weather and cost of living. And the individual tends to choose the location. Sometimes I would say that's mostly 70% of the time, the individual chooses the location. 30% of the time, it'll be the company that suggests going to certain places. We've got a client who's got offices in Asia, Southeast Asia, where they actually need talent there, and they're encouraging their employees to go there. And as long as they meet their visa requirements, why not, really?
Okay, and that's going to be one of the keys we come on to, I think, around visa requirements and actually the legality and the legal piece around working in country, because I think that can actually be overlooked, and we'll come on to that in a bit more detail, Di. Deval, I'm going to bring you in on this one as well, because it'd be great to just provide a bit of a background to your role and globalization partners. But if you could just talk through, what you're seeing, how you help businesses, and what you're seeing in terms of trends around where businesses are wanting to recruit or people are located versus where, in an ideal world, companies would like them to be located.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. Lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Great chat and good to be on the panel with Laura and Diane. Yeah, I mean, I'll explain what EOR is later on, I think, but certainly as an employer of record and as a global employer of record, we're seeing it from the business's point of view, and it's really interesting hearing Laura and Diane speak specifically around what the professionals and individuals are demanding. Certainly from our side, companies are now actively scouting the globe for talent, and there's a whole host of reasons why. I think, as Laura was alluding to, certainly COVID and pandemic and post-pandemic has kind of shifted us into a direction that perhaps we hadn't foreseen, but it's still complicated, right? There's still a spectrum on which companies are based on. But certainly what we're seeing is that there is a drive for global workforce, because, to put it quite bluntly, certainly in the West, we simply can't find the talent, or the skill set is not surfacing quickly enough for us to build out the workforce to be able to build and grow the businesses in the fashion that we want. Certainly the UK, US, Australia, France, Germany, big labor pools, deep and wide, but still those businesses that certainly we talk to are still finding it increasingly hard to find the talent that they are seeking. So they're scouting the world, and for us, that the markets that are mainstay, and this wouldn't be a surprise to yourselves or the audience, are the UK still a strong market for hires. Canada's very attractive, and then locations like India and the Philippines, Spain, interestingly as well, Mexico. Some of these may come under kind of exotic, if you like, but these are talent pools and talent hubs that are starting to become very attractive locations and destinations for our businesses.
And it's interesting you mentioned the Spain point. If I understand correctly, Spain have and other countries, to be fair, have specifically sort of opened themselves up to this remote working, to encourage remote workers in location, quite simply through things like tax breaks and tax advantages for a number of years. And so I can understand why some of these countries would have been key locations that people want to work in. Coming back to sort of the weather's nice, the sun's out 300 days of the year type thing, and then you've got the tax breaks on top. I can see why that is a real pull for people to want to work there remotely. Deval, just on this point, with the clients you're working with, the contacts you're working with, would you say pretty much any location isn't considered out of bounds, providing they want to recruit that person, or there's a demand in that particular area of the world? Or are there certain areas or countries where companies just don't want to go because of the legal implications or the administrative burden on it, for example?
I mean, certainly the latter point, we can't dodge that, right? I mean, I mean, everyone on this panel is fully fixated, quite rightly, on compliance, ensuring everything's done as legally as possible, and that's not least us. It's a good question. I think, you know, I think on one of the titles, I think it's push pull. It depends, which is a terrible answer, but certainly what we're seeing, and again, if I draw back to the kind of the markets that I described earlier, Lee, I think some of those emerging markets, like if I kind of rattle off four: Poland, Vietnam, Argentina, Canada. And apologies, that sounds very random, but it's EMEA, APAC, LATAM, and North America. I think what's underpinning those hubs is their educational systems, quite frankly. There's a big groundswell of talent that are being churned out of pretty well recognized universities, right, in those locations, who are now graduating individuals with those skill sets, particularly in STEM subjects, and particularly around AI, that is now becoming a real attraction for globally mobile companies who are desperately seeking individuals with those skill sets, those understandings around machine learning, because that is the direction of travel for a lot of our companies, including us and those on the call.
Yeah. Okay. And Laura, just thinking about back to the sort of putting a framework in place around remote working and what you're seeing and all the factors that need to and the stakeholders that need to go into putting that together. What are some of the key drivers around that, and what are some of maybe the deal breakers you're seeing where you're going, companies just won't allow X, Y, and Z because of?
Yeah, and I think it's such an interesting topic, isn't it? Because it's definitely not a one size fits all when it comes to remote working, and certainly see a difference in the approach to it based on industry sector. So there's certain sectors, especially when we think about legal firms, who absolutely are 100% compliant, and therefore in terms of thresholding for a remote working policy, tend to be on the lower end of number of days that they'll allow someone to remote work in a country, and will restrict the locations quite heavily to probably only countries where individuals may be a national of that location, so can guarantee that right to work. And then you can go all the way through to, the big tech giants. And remember at the time of COVID, when the idea of working from anywhere first hit, and the largest tech businesses were saying that quite openly, our employees can work from anywhere in the world. We don't mind. We're totally flexible. We do so. And so we tend to have quite a broad spectrum of people who would allow fully remote working, down to people within legal and professional professions who at the start of the pandemic, and BDO included, where we had a zero tolerance policy on it because, from a compliance perspective, we just knew what those risks were, and, we're not wanting to trigger a permanent establishment for corporate purposes, not wanting to risk people working without appropriate visas in location, not wanting to run the risk of having to put a payroll in place and pay the social security liabilities, all those common factors. And what's been interesting now is that I think that there's an acceptance of meeting somewhere in the middle, and again due to that employee attraction and retention point, and that if you see other businesses within your industry who are offering more flexibility and the ability to work from overseas, that there is this fear that you'll lose your top talent to those organisations. And so what we're starting to see now is that most businesses do want to offer it, and it can work really well, just so long as you get the right guidance in place. And then to the other point around stakeholders, Lee, I think what we have seen with some organisations is that, dependent again on the industry sector, there will be some countries where there's just an absolute bar on doing business in that location, because just the risk from a cyber security perspective will just mean that there's certain locations which are automatically not approved for remote working.
Gotcha. The cyber security piece is an interesting one, Laura. We've obviously had a few discussions offline around that, and I didn't fully appreciate how key that had been in driving some of these decision some of these decisions around where people are remote working, but it's understandable. You know, the cyber risk and the data protection piece is key, and I think some of that, I wouldn't say was overlooked, but was put towards the bottom of the list to begin with, and it's coming up the list quite quickly, I would say. So I'm going to come back to you in a sec, but Deval, just coming back to you on this, because I think, would it be fair to say that you're largely working with organisations where maybe there are a small number, or one or two individuals that they want to recruit in a new location, move to a new location for good business reasons. What are they sort of focusing on? What I mean by that is, what are they prioritizing? Are they even thinking about some of these issues when they've never been in a country before? When they're going, we just want this person because they're going to be key to the organization. They've got the skills we want. You mentioned some of the good reasons around education system coming through, you know, the skills coming through in certain countries, and businesses need those skills. Are they even thinking about some of the wider issues, or actually is it even part of the, I suppose, part of the consideration? What I mean by that is, are they aware of them, but automatically they're going, well, but we just need these people.
Yeah.
What are they doing around some of these issues around the edge when they're going into country for the first time, for example?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I should hasten to add, based on what Laura said, we ourselves at GP, we're a fully remote workforce and have been essentially from our inception. So we're about 1,400 people globally. And so lots of lessons that we can draw upon ourselves, and picking up what Laura and Diane have said certainly resonates with us. Typical use cases, I mean, the top of the use case in terms of why companies utilize or leverage our global employment platform, which is the employer record model, is because they want to test a new market, right? I mean, there's, and I think Laura made a good point again around, it is not one size fits all. A lot of our companies, we are sector agnostic, but a lot of our companies are software firms, tech firms, in the business services space in broad terms. You know, those knowledge workers, that's where we probably speak loudest in terms of our solutions. So back to your point, Leo, question is around, you know, what's particularly interesting for our companies is when they're looking to expand into a new market. They've done their homework, they've spoken to BDO around, you know, is this a market or markets that we need to kind of tap into? But they don't really want to go fully in, right? You know, it costs a lot of money, as we've always said, and folks on this panel know this for sure. You know, international expansion is not for the faint-hearted. So you're constantly looking to mitigate your risks. So testing new markets, placing a few hires on the ground. Maybe they're contractors, maybe they're permanent members of staff, but small satellite teams to essentially test your product market fit. Again, with the best homework in the world, you don't really know until you try. So the ability to dial up and dial down using a platform or a business model that is employee of record like ours is quite attractively in terms of, you know, doing that first 12 to 24 months. Yeah, and you know, if all goes well for that customer, after 24 months, they'll decide, actually, now we have traction in market, we've built a customer base, we've built up a channel of partners, and now we look to kind of, again, talk to BDO and set up our infrastructure and bring everything in-house.
Gotcha. It's we've already got through quite a lot. It's naturally at a relatively high level because of the time, and we've got an hour on this webinar. But we've got through quite a lot already, and it doesn't surprise me that employers and employees are still finding this a challenge. There are so many considerations actually that we weren't even aware that needed to be factored in, that are starting to be factored into this discussion about remote working, employer requirements, employee wants and needs. I'm not surprised that businesses and employees are still trying to find a happy medium, a common ground on this. I think, Laura, one of the comments you made, and we've all kind of known we've made, is that this flexible remote way of working is here to stay. It's largely the right answer for most businesses, for most employees, not all, and they'll know why, because of the industry they're in, or the fact that you need people on location or on site. With that in mind, if we just move on a couple of slides, that would be great, Natalie. Most businesses, I think, are going to be, and we just move on one more, most businesses are going to be in the position where they have to think about, this is the right answer for our businesses, this is the right answer for our workforce. So what are some of the key considerations? Now, we've touched on a few of these already as part of the discussion, but Di, I'm going to come back to you. And the reason being is, and it's a comment I made a few minutes back, is I think often that the immigration visa piece is actually overlooked. And that is almost the first thing that needs to be thought about is if we want to hire someone and we want to recruit, can they or should they be in this country? Can they legally be working in this country? And I think that's key. So one of the questions we had, though, was a starting point is, should remote working even be allowed across border? And I suppose the simple answer is, well, you could say no, and that gets rid of the problem. But I think, as Laura said, a lot of businesses have been there and realised that was okay to start with. It dealt with a short-term answer to the question. But the reality is that there needs to be an allowance of cross-border remote working. So with that in mind, if we're going to say we are going to allow it, what are some of the key considerations around the visa work permit piece and the right to work?
Yeah, that's a good question, Lee. I mean, you're absolutely right. And going back to Dhaval's point about, and also Laura's point about, that remote working is here to stay. There is always that sort of like trepidation about clients thinking, well, can this person go? Should this person go? The most important thing is to put immigration on your corporate agenda. Everybody loves to say, businesses love to say, oh, we're going to open up an office in Singapore, or, we've got a client, it's client driven, and the client says they've got work in Poland. Let's send some people over there. But there's no thought about whether that individual has the legal right to work there. It is super important to think about that. And if you send people, we've had cases where clients have sent people over, a team of 4 or 5 people to go into the country to do their little research, to do their fact finding, and then actually cross into what we call productive work. So work that they would be doing in their home country. At that point, they will need work authorization. They do need a visa. They do need a work permit. And this is something that businesses tend to forget. They'll say, oh, well, that's fine. You can go and we'll mask it down as a business meeting. You'll hear a lot of stories in the news about this, where people have been deported from that country, and governments make examples. They always have. They make examples of big companies because they're good stories. So it's really important to think about visa requirements. To the point that Laura mentioned earlier on as well, it's a lot easier if you send somebody from that country who's a national of that country in the first instance to do the remote work, to do the initial sort of like fact-finding process. And then you automatically, if you don't have your own office, you'd go to somebody like Dhaval, Global GP, where, you'd say, right, okay, we need an employer record because we don't want to spend the money in opening up our own office just yet because the risks are too high. So it is client driven. And once the client actually builds a brand, at that point, whether it's 18 months time, 24 months time, that's when they can actually look at opening up their own office within that country.
Okay. And just on this is something I hadn't particularly thought about until you made a comment the other day, and you mentioned it just now, productively non-productive work and what the implications of that are. So can you just expand on what that is and what the implications are? Would be great.
Sure. So there is, you're absolutely right. There's misconception between productive and non-productive work. For non-productive work, which is your business visitor visa, which means that you can travel to the US on an ESTA or go to Germany on your standard, sort of as a visa-free national. You can go in there and you can attend business meetings, seminars, training. You can do anything that does not financially benefit yourself or the company. And also you should not do stuff that you do on a day-to-day basis in your home country. In some countries, they're specifically strict about this. Canada's one of them, where even answering an email, an office email, is actually doing productive work, and therefore you need work authorization for that. So work authorization, productive work is what you would do on your day-to-day basis in your office at home, in your home country. That's the most binary way of looking at it.
Okay. I mean, it's a simple way of looking at it as well, right? So that's when you go from we might have an issue and think about to we almost certainly have an issue and have we done the right thing? And if we think about, because I'll come on to Laura and Dhaval for comments on this in just a minute, but if we think about the usual time frame for someone wanting to work remotely, it's usually within a few weeks or a month, shall we say, is my take on it and what I generally see. But how long can a work permit or visa take to actually come through, Di, to give someone the legal right to work in a country?
Yeah, so this can range from 4 weeks right up to 6 months. And this is something that businesses have to really take into consideration. It'll take 6 months to get a work permit for a European country. It can take 4 weeks to get a work permit in the UK if the company has if somebody's coming into the UK, as long as the company has a sponsor license. But in terms of global movements, you've got to make sure that you allow up to 6 months for that visa. To get your visa through your in your home country, to go through your biometrics, to get your approval through various authorities, it takes 6 months.
And Laura Duval, coming on to you in turn, how does that tie in, that potential up to 6 month lead time, with actually what we've seen in practice about the time between request for remote working and being a remote worker?
Yeah. Well, I mean, on the question regarding immigration and work permits, Lee and Diane know this, we work closely. It's the very first question we ask, right? But we can't move until the right and the correct work permits are in place. And so when we're talking to a customer who's new to our model, it's the first question: is that person native? Are they kind of moving into country? Are they currently with an employer but still on some sort of sponsorship? And this is Diane's territory. So we often kind of would offload that to Diane and BDO. You do your thing, and of course that very much depends on which market you're operating in. It may take some time, it may not, before you loop back to us at Employer Record, and we look to onboard them, and we look to onboard them pretty quickly. So in the scenario, just as a side, perhaps Lee, in a scenario that this person is permitted to work in whatever market in which we're talking about, we can onboard someone within a week or two, right? Not least because we are an employer and incorporated in that market. So we can move pretty quick and fast, but we've got the guardrails in place that we have to adhere to.
Okay, and Laura, how does this tie in? Because my feeling on this and what I'm seeing is the request can be 1 or 2 weeks before someone wants to go, but you might need to sit there for 6 months. So what are companies doing with that disconnect?
Yeah, so I think part of introducing a international remote working policy is education of the business. So when you actually implement the policy and make it live, setting in to the policy that there will be a time frame in which you need to submit your application. I know here at BDO, we have a specific time frame as well, that you can't request it within so many weeks of wanting to do the period of remote work, and that's largely to give whoever's responsible for analysing the risks and making sure that compliance is met in enough time to be able to do that as well. So I think realistically it is about that education piece, that when you make the benefit available to your employees, that you also make it very clear that there are some expectations of the employee as well, and that they're going to need to meet their side of the bargain if they want to leverage the benefit.
Yeah, and that's fair. That it is back to that, having that framework that everyone understands and understanding the reason why it's in place. It's not that we're saying no, it's that we've got some legal obligations that we must meet to remain compliant, but we'll absolutely help you work remotely and support that, as long as we're doing the right thing, of course.
Sorry, Lee, can I just kind of step in here, if you don't mind? One thing that may be adjacent to what has just been discussed is the misclassification, often the misclassification of workers, particularly contractors. It's another use case as to why companies come and speak to us. I think this is probably age old in terms of how, when particularly VC-backed firms who move at such a pace and hiring lots and lots of people, satellite teams across the world, and perhaps make slight missteps, or often more than slight missteps, around how they draw up contracts. And we often see from our side companies who get to a certain critical mass of employees have a whole myriad of employment contracts. And quite frankly, I've got to a place called concern about how that's perceived in different markets. So that misclassification of workers, which I know Laura and Diane are kind of very much in tune with, is something that certainly folks on this call should be evaluating and ensuring they check for all the employees around the globe.
Yeah, and I think what you're referring to there, of course, is the whole: are they employees? Are they contractors? Are they self-employed? Are they operating through a personal service company? It absolutely is a key part of this, because without understanding that, you don't know how you can engage them. You don't know the tax and social security implications. All sorts of things fall off the back of.
And the legal and financial consequences can be quite significant. So
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And then that is another key aspect of this, of course, one of the many key aspects. In the interest of moving things on, again, we've only scratched the surface of this, because this is just a summary of some of the key points, and there's so much to think about when allowing someone, enabling someone to work remotely. But moving on to the next slide, ESG, environmental, social, and governance. It is a key part of business and how we do things. And I know, Laura, I'll come on to you in just a sec on this, but a lot of this seems to be embedded within remote working and enabling remote working. Laura, I know you had some comments specifically around the ESG piece and then the tie-in on this.
Yeah, so I think on the environmental side, obviously most organisations now have got a keen eye on business travel, and the number of flights, and just travel more generally that people are undertaking. Some organisations actually having dashboards for individuals to monitor their own carbon footprints. And I think it's a really interesting one, isn't it? Just when we think about that push-pull between employer and employee, that if we think about that first category of remote worker, and the ones that Deval's team will assist with, those people who are being hired 100% on a remote basis from another country. But in terms of, how do you embed the culture of the business for that particular individual, then there's this sense now that we want to get people together more. So are there going to be unintended ESG consequences as a result of that? Because you're suddenly flying people potentially all over the world so that they can meet together in person. And then I think from the social aspect, I think that there can be real positive implications for employees in terms of that second bunch of remote workers, who are the ones who are, wanting to work from a remote location because for personal reasons, they might be a foreign national working in the UK, want to spend more time with their family and friends, and the knock-on impact of that may be, if they spend more time remote working from their home countries, will they actually do fewer flights overall during the period of the year? So it's an inherently complex topic, but I think you're right, Lee, it's one where when thinking about offering flexibility and remote work options, thinking of this in line with your ESG strategy is really important.
It has to be interwoven, doesn't it? If nothing else, that travel piece. But that's not the only area. We know that. And Deval, I know there was a specific piece around the social part of this that you wanted just to provide some comment on as well.
Yeah, and I just concur with Laura again from a GP perspective. 1,400 people we're effectively remote workers. Our kind of travel plans are always being evaluated. I think but just by design, I think our carbon footprint we hope is fairly small and mitigating, which I think is hugely important. From a social point of view, as I was talking to you earlier in the week, Lee, it's one of the things that it's a catchphrase that we often use, but it's certainly not marketing speak. We often say that behind every hire is a human being, and we genuinely mean that. We talk to a lot of companies who've got big grand plans, but we never lose sight of the fact that on the other side of that fence, so to speak, there are individuals who are working in locations, often in isolated remote situations, and eyes wide open for them for sure. But we never lose sight of that. And I think just from an ESG point of view, and what's really gratifying and I find really exciting is the fact that companies now who are actively seeking to hire talent wherever they may be, which basically means that individuals that perhaps historically have been shut out, excluded from the global employment market, particularly females, in lots of countries around the world, are now effectively earning good salaries, dare I use the phrase almost global salaries, for multinational companies, whilst at the same time remaining in the cities and towns, or perhaps even villages in which they live, and with all the caring responsibilities that perhaps come with those folks as well. So I think we're definitely moving into a much healthier direction and space going forward under the catch-all term that is ESG.
Yeah, and I can think of some, one or two of the locations you're probably referring to there, Deval, where it fits nicely with sort of the cultural heritage and background of that location, but also tying in with the way of working and the global workforce, which is really good to see, as you say. So just moving on again, please, Natalie. And this is just the second poll question. It'd just be useful, and I appreciate we've probably scratched the surface on a multitude of areas, and we could spend literally days on this, I think. But just a second polling question for you all on the webinar. It'd be really useful for us to understand, just based on the discussions we've had so far today, if there's some of the some areas where you've got gaps in your remote working policy, or you've got gaps in terms of how things are being done already, which area or areas do they fall into? And this is multi-choice, so do take your time just to think about some of the key areas where you still think things are falling through the cracks potentially, or you don't have all the information you need. So just thinking about the immigration piece that mostly Di's touched upon, we haven't really got into too much detail around personal tax, social security and payroll, but almost certainly where people are going to move and work in another location, that is an obligation, even if you haven't got an entity in that country. That's certainly largely what we see. There can be employment and labour law issues, actually, and they can arise without you knowing about it. There doesn't necessarily need to be a contract linked to the country that someone's in to have employment law rights in that country. There's the wider tax piece around corporate tax and permanent establishment. Share plans, where you've got share plans, there's usually share plan reporting in countries, and countries where people are touching and working. There could be multiple countries where you've got share plan reporting. This is really common still. Actually, we've got a problem just tracking where people are. We don't know where they are. And Laura, mentioned that there are various ways that can be managed. And one of the big ways that is being done is around the use of tech. There's no policy at the moment for remote or hybrid working. That's not uncommon. It's something, again, that we've touched on, that companies are working their way through. We don't have an entity in location where Deval and GP might be able to help, as an example, but we do have remote workers. The cyber security and risk piece, have we even thought about it? Have we got the right stakeholders involved? And keeping our workforce engaged. Actually, that culture piece and values piece, how can we keep people feeling tied and bought into an organisation if they're not spending time with their colleagues or in an office, for example? So it'd be really useful to see the results on this and where there are gaps for you all. Okay, so a fairly even spread, I will say. Nothing overly stand out, other than possibly the personal tax, social security and payroll piece, which is taking up roughly half. But so lots of gaps in lots of areas, which again is not unexpected. I think that tax, social security and payroll piece can catch people out, actually, because there's not always an understanding that can arise from day one, even if you don't have an entity in that location. That's where an employer of record can help, for example, because that can function as the employer and as the payroll. So thank you for that feedback, very useful. So just moving on again, actually, and very, very brief, we've got 10 minutes or so left and one more. We mentioned that we're going to spend most of the time just talking about where we've got to today and what we're seeing today. But actually going into 2024, and Laura, I'll come back to you on this, just to feed in, because this is some of the BDO forecasting for 2024 and beyond. What are we seeing through this year and the next few years, Laura? What do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, so I think it was a really interesting statistic that came out of the tech trends forecasting, and this is a survey that this is a forecast that BDO do internally based on things that we're seeing in the market, and really surprising, because based on what I was saying earlier, that during the pandemic and as we first started to emerge after COVID, it was very much tech businesses that were saying to everybody, work from anywhere, it's absolutely fine, we don't mind you doing that. And what we're now starting to see is that it's actually the tech companies that are doing a U-turn on this. And we know, we've seen it in the news, that they're the first ones to say we want everybody back in an office pretty much 5 days a week. It's all about collaboration and spending time together, and I think that, again, it's quite industry specific as to how far organisations will go in terms of fully back in the office, fully remote, hybrid somewhere in the middle. But it's certainly a shift in mentality. And I think coming back again to that point around what employers think is needed in terms of making sure that the culture of the business is there and that the business continues to do well versus employees. And, you know, I speak to very few people in work and out of work who want to go into an office 5 days a week again. So it is definitely that push-pull, but it's always interesting to see when tech companies come out and make some pretty bold statements around this when they were the ones leading the charge. But on the flip side of that, when we look at what governments are saying globally around the world and legislation that we're starting to see come out. And I think you touched on it earlier, Lee, that some countries where tourism obviously is a big part of their economy, then they're quite eager to get people to spend even longer in country, holiday, and please do come and remote work in our country as well. And please come and, you know, continue to spend your money in our restaurants and bars. And I think governments are trying to respond to this. And what we've obviously seen within the cross-border teleworking framework, which for those who aren't up to speed with this, it's to do with the international social security rules within Europe. But they've actually relaxed some of the rules to reflect the fact that some people will work remotely from another location and don't necessarily want that individual to fall within the social security regime of that location, because it just builds up a lot of complexities. And actually, governments responding and accepting the fact that remote is the way of the world now. So I think very interesting. And my personal view is that we'll probably see things much in the way that we are now, but probably with an increased number of people taking the benefit of remote working internationally that maybe haven't done so far.
Mm-hmm. I think that the tech trend in particular interests me, that, as you say, you know, a few years back, these are the ones at the vanguard of work anywhere, do anything you want at any time almost, because we're a tech business and we can support that. But now they're now the ones partly wanting a return to office and probably seeing the disconnect of their workforce and the value of being together at least some of the time. So that one's a really interesting one. If we move on one more as well. Deval, I'm just going to come to you, conscious of time, and just some feedback from a Globalisation Partners survey that I think was carried out late 2023 and predicting into 2024. Can you just talk us through some of the key themes and trends that you're seeing and where we think, or you think, things are going?
Yeah, it probably also picks up from what Laura was saying. I think, you know, there's always been I think there's been a tension, right, between employer and employee for a few years now. Certainly pandemic kind of stress tested that relationship. But I think what this is showing is that, based on surveys that we've done, and we did one recently of about 2,500 executives, I think, across 5 markets, and equally, I think, double that size in terms of professionals and employees, to kind of get a sentiment around, you know, that global mindset, global expansion. So, you know, what we're saying through these numbers as a narrative is that, you know, it's despite all this talk around recessions and high inflation, which does exist and is happening, business executives do still want to go global, and they still are now absolutely fixed as a strategy around global hiring. So that's one. That's those 2/3 on the number on the left hand side. Now, switch it over to the other side, on the supply side, we've got this really interesting phenomenon, particularly amongst younger employees who are now actively seeking to work for international companies. You know, there's probably a number of reasons why that is, but what they want to do is they want to work for global companies who offer them career opportunities to work with diverse workforces around the world, the opportunity to kind of perhaps work in different countries. So there's a real, and perhaps even there's a bit of stability as well underpinning that in working for a global workforce in the context of you know, tough macroeconomic challenges. And then in the middle of that is the fact that leaders are still finding it very, very challenging to find individuals in their localities And we always often say, why limit yourself to a 30-mile radius of your office, quote unquote, when you can scout the world? And so I think we've got this reasonably healthy meeting of minds between employees and employers. But it's still tough out there. I know I'm running out of time, but just one thing that's probably worth mentioning around going forward into the future, you know, workflow automation, the use of ML, the use of AI, that is now very much at the heart of everyone's plans at board level downwards. And I think what's exasperating that perhaps is because companies cannot find the skills, despite what the stat says. So there's a lot of reskilling agendas now embedding across businesses to ensure that existing employers are kind of, you know, developing their skills when it comes to data science and the use of AI tools. But certainly workflow automation is now very much in play, and that includes us at GP as well.
And that kind of feeds back to some of the comments you're making earlier, Deval, about where companies are needing, wanting to recruit to get that expertise into the business. I suppose that's driving it, and where the talent sits is where you need to recruit, quite frankly. Otherwise, you're not going to get into the business. Yeah. So we've got just a couple of minutes left. Q&A. Very, very conscious that that's all we have. We will come back to anyone specifically where we can see that you've asked a question. It's not on an anonymous basis. We'll try and pick up one or two of these as well. Laura, I'll probably come to you on one of these actually. Just high-level comments. There's a US employee who wants to work in the US for 3 weeks. US citizen and passport holder, but is this a problem given the short time frame? You know, do we have potential other issues there?
Yeah, so I think I saw on that comment that they are a US national. So I think that that's ticking the box to start with, and I know we'll make Diane happy. So from the immigration perspective, should be absolutely okay. When it is such a short period of time, then hopefully from a corporate tax PE perspective, it would be low risk of any issues there, but obviously would still just want to understand exactly what they're doing. Is it a precursor to more trips into the US? From an income tax and social security point of view, they should be able to leverage the double tax treaty and also the social security agreements between the UK and US, so that it should be very low risk of triggering anything from that perspective. Very high level, 10-second overview.
Very high level, yeah. No, but thank you for that, Laura. And just we're basically coming to the 2 o'clock mark, so I'll just bring things to a close with some final comments. So firstly, thank you so much to all of you for attending, and thank you to my panelists. Brilliant conversation. We barely scratched the surface of this, and I think genuinely we could bat this back and forth for days and still not get very far into it. There's so much to think about. Thank you for your feedback on the poll. As I said, any Q&As that come through where we can see that you've specifically asked a question, we know who's asked the question, we will come back to you. Natalie, if you can just flick on a slide. If you want to get in touch with any of us directly, where maybe you've asked an anonymous question, you want more information, please feel free to drop us a message. Just one final comment from me. We will be sending the slides out. We will also be sending a post-event survey out, and that will literally take a handful of minutes, 2 or 3 minutes to complete, only 3 questions. But if you could take some time to complete that and send a reply to us, that would be really helpful to us in terms of some of the things you would like more information on, or maybe some of the things you want to have more, a deeper discussion on. So that would be great. That'll be coming out to you with the rest of the material. Thank you to everyone for attending, and given the time, we'll bring that to a close there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Lee.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.